100% of the comments I received on last week's New Testament video were about my coffee mug. So, for those of you that are interested, this week's episode is brought to you by my elementary school, Vanderlyn Elementary. Go Vikings. Okay, we continue in the Gospel of Mark in week 2 of our 2020 Bible reading program in the New Testament, and the plan is linked in the description below, and the Old Testament track is also linked in the description below. But I mentioned last week how the Gospel of Mark breaks nicely at chapter 8. There's an interesting story where Jesus heals a blind man, but it takes him 2 touches. Now, what is this story all about? Well, in the story right before the blind man being healed in chapter 8, the disciples misunderstand something Jesus says. He speaks of the leaven of the Pharisees in a metaphorical sense, say watch out for their influence, but the disciples think he's talking about bread, and we didn't bring enough bread. Not to mention the fact he had just fed 4,000 people in this chapter and 5,000 people a couple chapters earlier. But what Jesus says to them is, you see, but you don't really see. By the way, this is the same quotation from chapter 4 when Jesus told the parables and said that many people would see Jesus, many people would hear his teachings, but they wouldn't really see or hear. And he's putting the disciples in that category. They see, but they don't really see. But I think it's the story following the story of the blind man in chapter 8 that really gets to the heart of what Jesus is doing throughout the story of Mark. Jesus will be alone with his disciples, and he talks to them about how he is perceived in public. And then he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, I think speaking for the rest of the disciples, says accurately, "You are the Christ." And Peter's right about that. The disciples see who Jesus is. And yet, immediately following that declaration, Jesus begins to say something he had not said before, as far as we know, which is that he is going to suffer. He's going to be rejected by the Jews, and he's going to die before being raised again. Peter doesn't like that. And Peter actually rebukes Jesus for what he says, and Jesus has to say, famously, "Get behind me, Satan." I think what this tells us about the structure of the Gospel of Mark is that up to this point in chapter 8, Jesus is demonstrating who he is. He's demonstrating that he is the Christ. But once his disciples get that, now he's going to try to teach them what it means that he is the Messiah. And so in chapter 8, in chapter 9, and in chapter 10, all in our reading this week, Jesus will make a prediction about his coming suffering. And notice that in each case, the disciples either push back or they just don't understand. And notice in chapters 8, 9, and 10 that there are fewer miracles recorded compared to what we saw earlier. And instead we see more teachings about what it means to follow Jesus. Specifically teachings about denying yourself, giving up your possessions perhaps, humbling yourselves, doing things that are hard, because if Jesus is the suffering Messiah, then all those who will be delivered by the suffering Messiah will themselves follow the path of suffering, of sacrifice, and of selflessness. But let me say one more thing about this. We saw this with the parables as well. But remember that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. If you notice when Jesus rebukes Peter, he says, "You are setting your mind on man's interest, not on God's interest." You see there's a mix-up in desire there. What's important to Peter. Similarly, in the previous story about the disciples' misunderstanding in chapter 8, he says, "You don't see, you don't hear, and you have a hardened heart." We should see in the Gospel of Mark that it is the heart of a person that will determine whether they get it, whether they receive Jesus' teaching or not. And we should notice that when we see people like the people of Nazareth in chapter 6, or Herod in chapter 6, or the scribes and Pharisees throughout this section, or the rich young ruler in chapter 10, or the disciples, or ourselves. That when we see people not understanding, that primarily Jesus says it's a heart problem. And so if we want to truly see clearly, then we need to get our hearts right. To be willing to receive the words of Jesus honestly and openly, and then to put those words into practice in our lives selflessly and sacrificially. And that's what he's trying to get across to his disciples in this section, and that's what Mark is trying to get across to his readers as well.